Hi everybody and welcome back to the Dirt Diaries. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss a new episode or new archaeological discovery. If you're listening to this as a podcast, don't forget to rate and comment. It really helps me out. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like and comment. That really helps me. And if you're new here, welcome. I hope you love ancient history, archaeology, mythology, mystery, and more as much as I do, because my name is Dr. Tenendra Kellenbarger and I bring the ancient world to you. Because no, this is not ancient aliens. This is the real thing. And of course, these are the Dirt Diaries. And a special shout out and hello to those lounging in the villa, taking notes in the library, or snooping in the restricted section over on Patreon. And last time on Dirt Diaries, well, we got to the bottom of a well in Athens where over 30 curse tablets turned up. Of course, this included the famed curse now known as the Curse of Glycera, where someone over 2,300 years ago anonymously cursed a newlywed woman, Glycera, and bound her to the god Hermes. What became of her, what happened to her, and what was the rest of her story? We don't know. And I know earlier in October, I mentioned we were going to discuss vampire burials in archaeology. And I wanted to do it right. So for that, I will in the future be needing to bring on a friend of mine, Dr. Howard Williams, also known as Archaeodeath, for his expertise on early medieval burials, before we delve into our own vampire and deviant burials here. So stay tuned in the future for that. So, because I wanted to stay on the spooky train for October, in the last few episodes, I touched on briefly the topic of necromancy. A little bit here and a little bit there, but now I thought it was a perfect time to talk about the skull-filled cave where necromancies were performed. And as always, I will be getting ready with you all just to keep my hands busy. So without further ado, let's raise the dead in the cave of necromancy. So for this find, we have to go a little bit into the past. Not too far, just back to 2010, because in 2010, this is when excavations actually began at the Telememe Cave. And Telememe Cave is actually located in the foothills right outside of Jerusalem. I think to get to this site, it is around a 30-minute drive. But the Telememe Cave is a famous cave. And these excavations that I'm going to be referring to throughout this episode, well, they began in 2010 and they went all the way through 2016. And this was not the first time excavations were going on in this cave system. In fact, this cave was the subject of many investigations prior to 2010. But the excavations going from 2010 through 2016 has a little something to do with necromancy, which is why we're all here today, right? Yes, in fact, it's believed that this cave actually served as an oracle of the dead. And here people would come from all over to find out the answers to their questions. Because yes, with necromancy, a fun fact about ancient necromancy is it's not always about raising the dead. But of course, we will dive into what necromancy is in a bit. So, from these excavation years, archaeologists uncovered a plethora of Roman-era oil lamps, weapons, pieces of pottery from earlier time periods, and human skulls that had been placed into deep niches within the cave. Now, it is these findings that led archaeologists and researchers here to believe that this cave system was actually used for cultic rites and rituals that may have had ties to necromantic practices, and all of this was actually published back in 2023. They also proposed that this may have been a site where possible human sacrifices occurred, and that the cultic activity here was really in the later Roman imperial period. So think 2nd century CE through 4th century CE. And if you're trying to place this in big name Roman emperors, around the time of Constantine, of course, Constantine is more 4th century CE, but 2nd century is really Trajan, Hadrian, can't forget Marcus Aurelius, Caracalla as well, he's 3rd century CE. And then, of course, a hop, skip, and a jump later, we get Constantine the First. And To the scholars working here, not only was this cave used for possible necromantic purposes, but it may have also been viewed as a portal into the underworld, which is perfect because within the last few episodes, we've been talking about possible entry points into the underworld, not only with cave sites, but with ancient necromancy sites. And these skulls and the other objects that were uncovered in excavations may have actually allowed the individuals who came into this cave to actually connect to the dead with this specific type of divination. Yes, necromancy in the ancient Greco-Roman world can be considered a type of divination. And while we know of a few cave necromantions, like that of Heraclea Pontica on the coast of the Black Sea in modern-day Turkey, there's also one on the mainland of Greece at Cape Taneron. So it makes sense that the ancients could have also viewed this site at the Teomim Cave as a possible entryway into the underworld, because both Cape Taneron and Heraclea Pontica, while they were necromancions, so specializing in the art and practice of necromancy, while they were also viewed as a gateway to the underworld. And of course, I briefly mentioned in a prior episode that at these sites where necromancies were performed, if you were seeking guidance from the dead or anything like that, there would have been priests or priestesses or anybody who was trained in the art of necromancy to help assist you in your divination journey with the deceased. Why? Because this was a learned art and skill, and you had to be sure that you knew what you were doing. We talked about this last time with curse tablets, and necromancy is the same way. Not everybody could perform magic in the ancient world, and not everybody knew how to do necromancy. And in some places, at some ancient sites, at ancient necromancy sites, I should say, well, these priests or priestesses could also be referred to as oracles of the dead. In fact, at Cape Taneron on Greece, the mainland of Greece, I should say, well, this is located right next to, I believe it's a temple to Poseidon. And what's interesting is this cave is actually referred to as an oracle of the dead. Well, a Dr. 10 tangent is that oracles have a dual meaning in the ancient world. For example, oracles can be the, priests and or priestesses or the inspired individuals who utter the words of the god that they are an oracle for. So for example, at the site of Delphi, the Pythia, the priestess, she would be inhaling the noxious fumes and she would be uttering divine words from Apollo. So the oracle can actually be the priest and or priestess themselves, or it can be the message that the inspired priest or priestess tells you. That is also referred to as an oracle, is the message. And so it's a little complex, but technically in the ancient world, an oracle could be both the priest and or priestess, or it could be the message. Now, according to the archaeologists and scholars, one of the giveaways that this site and cave may have been used for necromantic practices comes from the discovery of over 120 oil lamps that were systematically placed throughout the cave. And they weren't just yeeted in there without purpose. These oil lamps were not placed with the purpose in mind being to light the way. Nay, these oil lamps, they were actually placed deep in hidden and recessed niches, likely as part of a larger ritual or rite. Now, to my knowledge, lamps were used in necromantic rites as another form of divination. But when lamps are involved in the overall practice of necromancy, I'm not too sure how else they would be used outside of further divination, which is known as lichnomancy, because the placement of these lamps being super deep in the recesses and niches of this cave system doesn't really fit with the necromantic instructions of what one would have to do to consult with a shade. Normally, you have to dig 2 pits and light a fire. But of course, in lichnomancy, you can use an oil lamp for divination. So for lichnomancy, for this specific type of divination, those who were trained in this art form would actually be looking at the flame in the oil lamp for images, symbols, shadows, and more, and then interpret that to the individual. And this type of divination has been known about since the classical period of Greece. So the fact that it's still showing up in the later Roman imperial period does make sense. And some of the niches inside this cave also held weapons, along with the pottery that dates to earlier periods. And sometimes in these niches, alongside of the lamps, were human skulls. And you may be wondering, well, are we sure they're human skulls? Yes, human skulls look vastly different than animal skulls. So let's break this down. Why are ancient individuals placing weapons in a cave where necromancy possibly was performed? Well, when somebody performs necromancy, weapons like swords and or daggers, depending what you had on you, were kind of needed for your own protection, because sometimes some of these shades or whoever else you summoned up from the underworld, well, sometimes they would not be simpatico, and having a weapon with you would ensure that the guests from beyond the grave would stay back. And swords and daggers actually, to the ancient authors and individuals, well, they worked great against spirits, shades, and the dead, especially when they were made out of iron or bronze. Why? Because iron and bronze were believed to be metals that could actually be used against supernatural forces. Okay, now on to why are the human skulls here? Well, the archaeologists who were excavating noted that they were located nearby oil lamps and thus were likely part of the overall ritualistic magic that was occurring here. Which, okay, this does kind of fit within the Greco-Roman tradition of necromantic practices and from what we know occurring elsewhere. For we also have writings that talk about divination with a skull or even a head. I believe that it's part of the myth of Orpheus, because things don't go well for Orpheus, but his head is also used for divination. But yes, divination with a skull was used back in the ancient day and time, and this type of divination is actually called cephalomancy. And it's a bit different as compared to looking for images or shadows in an oil lamp, because here you would actually take the skull, you would inscribe your question or inquiry onto its forehead, sometimes with snake blood, depending on if the ritual or instructions denoted so. And then after you write your question on the skull's forehead, there is a ritual that goes with it so that you can get your answer. But okay, let's talk necromancy in the Greco-Roman world, because this is one of my favorite topics to discuss with my students each and every year. So from me to you, I hope you enjoy the topic of necromancy today. So at its base, what is necromancy? Really, at the end of the day, in its simplest form, necromancy to the Greco-Romans and the Mediterranean world, they thought of it as divination or communication with the dead. Now, divination was not always done in necromancy, but many times we do see other forms of divination occurring. So you can think of it this way. All squares are considered rectangles, but not all rectangles are considered squares. So all necromancies are communication with the dead, but not every necromancy included divination. And really, the goal at the end of the day was not to raise the dead, unlike what Hollywood wants us to believe, but it was mainly to learn something from the deceased that you had a question about. And why would you go to the dead if you had questions? Well, it's because the ancient individuals believed that once you died, you then became a little bit more privy to knowledge that you would not have been able to acquire or know about while you were living. But necromancy is also not simply just communicating with the deceased individuals who you are trying to summon. Necromancy to the ancients was also considered such if you actually went into the underworld. So, for example, our buddy Odysseus back in the Odyssey technically does perform necromancy because he has to skedaddle down to the underworld where he has to talk with the deceased individual, Tiresias. So because Odysseus goes down and chats with who he needs to, he also comes across other ghosts and actually communicates with them as well. He runs into Agamemnon. I believe he also runs into Heracles and Achilles. He also runs into, oh my goodness, what is his friend's name who falls off of the roof on Circe's island? Elpenor. It's Elpenor. Ghost of Elpenor. Yes, he actually comes up to Odysseus and says, hey, can you go and bury my body? And like Hollywood today with trying to show us that it's all about raising the dead for necromancy, well, the ancient individuals also had a lot of differing opinions on the practice itself. Like many of us today, we might be going to the newest opening of The Conjuring or Paranormal Activity back when they were still producing those videos. Many of us still love haunting stories or ghost stories, just like the ancients, but when you brought up necromancy to the ancients, well, their opinions were pretty varied across the board. Heck, some ancients back 2,000 years ago thought that necromancy and even shades, well, they thought that they were scary. Or some would actually say that the practice of necromancy was ill-intentioned. Many may say that it was only something that witches did, or any other people that they did not want to be associated with. It was said that only they performed necromancy, magic, and more. And with necromancy, this was actually something that the Romans were pretty weary of. It seems that the ancient Greeks were a little bit more accepting of this practice. The ancient Romans would have judged people super harsh on it, especially emperors. Because if an emperor was found to have actually performed necromancy, well, their citizens may have considered that to be un-Roman of them. And their citizens may actually be kind of nervous that this practice would have actually put the entire Roman Empire into impietas, which is just basically meaning you are out of peace and out of balance with the gods. Normally, the ancient Romans would strive to be in pietas with their gods. But of course, tale as old as time, we do know of a few Roman emperors who were said to have performed necromancy. So famously in history, well, the Roman Emperor Nero, well, he kills his mother. And after he killed her, well, he was plagued with nightmares. I can't imagine why. And so to help ease and basically kind of put to bed these nightmares, well, Nero gets in touch with a magi. And magi are individuals from the East who were trained in magic, different divination practices, and more. So he gets in touch with a magi. And this magi summons the ghost of his mother so that he can beg for her forgiveness because he murdered her, and then goes to lay a ghost, would go to lay her spirit. And I know last time on the Dirt Diaries, I mentioned the infamous sorceress and witch known as Erichtho, and she does show up in necromancy stories too. And specifically, she reanimates a corpse for Sextus Pompey, and he was a general, just for chronology, he was a general back in the 1st century BCE. So before the time that we're talking about with this cave, but it's still a spooky story of necromancy nonetheless. And just as a quick little spark note addition to bring you all back up to who Erichtho was back in the ancient day and time, well, she was a terrifying sorceress and witch that was said to have lived in tombs and collected human body parts to use in her dark magic. And we have a description of her from Daniel Ogden's Greco-Roman necromancy book. Quote, "The smoking ashes and burning bones of the young she snatches from the center of the pyre." This is a funerary pyre that she's in reference to. "And the very torch from the hands of the parents. She gathers up the pieces of the bier, fluttering in the black smoke, and the grave clothes as they crumble into ashes and the cinders that reek of the corpse. But when the dead are confined in stone, which drains off the internal moisture, absorbs the corruption of the marrow, and makes the corpse rigid, then the witch eagerly vents her rage on all the limbs, thrusting her fingers into the eyes, scooping out gleefully the stiffened eyeballs and gnawing the yellow nails on the withered hand. Yikes. Immediately, no. So we already are having this inherent image in our head of what witches and Erichtho and these people who are said to perform necromancy are doing. And already it's being painted as the other. We don't want to be associated with that, is how the ancients would have approached this. They heard about that and they were really like, you know what? Nah, man, I'll be over here if you need me. Another emperor who was accused of performing necromancy was that of Hadrian, and he reigns in the 2nd century CE. And really, his story is fascinating because Hadrian had taken a young male lover, and everybody knew about this, and his name was Antonius. And unfortunately for Antonius, he died very, very young. He actually drowned in the Nile River. And because of, his mysterious drowning, because we don't really know exactly what happened that day. So because of his mysterious drowning, because of his relationship with Hadrian, well, some rumors started to swirl in Rome. Some of which were that Hadrian actually murdered him to perform necromancy, or that Antonius himself sacrificed himself so that Hadrian could perform a necromancy. And in necromancies and even in curse tablets, the ghost and shade of Antonius becomes a very popular restless ghost that individuals in the ancient world would have tried to summon or invoke to do their bidding. Other emperors accused of necromancy are Commodius, Ditus Julianus, Caracalla, Elagabalus, Valerian, Maxentius, and Constantius II. And it was kind of considered to be a huge no-no for emperors to perform necromancy because it could have been viewed as an abuse of power and authority. Okay, for makeup or the look, well, if you're watching, you know that I figured the look out because I filmed the introduction after I do the whole rest of the podcast. So we know I put a look together. What that look is, we're not too sure, and hopefully I pull it together at the end. But I think for today, I want to try and do makeup that is reminiscent of Thorn from the Hex Girls, but also could be a Bride of Dracula. We like that because this is coming out in the week of Halloween. So we'll do like a red and black kind of look today. Okay, we got it. So not only was it seen as an abuse of wealth and power for Roman emperors to perform necromancy, but it was also kind of warned against for fear of it being tied with foretelling an individual's death. And just like astrology, this was a huge no-no because if you could foretell somebody's death or the end of their reign, well, you just became public enemy number one to a Roman emperor because, people would pay probably good money to figure out how long they were going to rule and use that information against an emperor, especially an unpopular one. And this would set off all of the alarms for the Roman emperor because he wouldn't want this information to leak out anywhere. And because of the fear of foretelling the length of a reign of an emperor or even the end of his life and how he would die, well, Roman Emperor Augustus, he actually passes a law that banned the use of magic and divination to predict death. So people could use it. People could use divination. People could use magic. People were still doing curse tablets. People were still, being astrologers back in the day and time. But you just couldn't use it to predict death, namely a Roman emperor's death. Anything else was fair game, it seemed. And his successor, Tiberius, he actually made it a crime if an individual asked a sorceress, a magi, a witch about the death of an emperor. Well, he made that a crime that was punishable by death. And we actually have a fun story about an instance of necromancy with Caracalla because he was accused of performing necromancy, and there's a fun story that goes along with it. It's not haha funny, but it is a little tee-hee. So, Caracalla, he is reigning in the early 200s CE after the death of his father, Septimus Severus. Him and his brother Geta, they actually are co-rulers with one another, and then his brother dies. He wouldn't know anything about that. But once he becomes full emperor, it's around 210, 209, something like that, and some change. But apparently Caracalla actually ordered one of his administrators to perform necromancy. And you may be wondering, why would he do this? Well, Caracalla was a little paranoid, and he wanted to know, through the art of necromancy, if anybody had planned to kill him. And when push comes to shove, who are you going to call? That's right, the ancient ghosts, to help answer your question. And not only was he paranoid about, somebody plotting to kill him, but he was a little paranoid as well about being overthrown. So, just like anybody would, he had his administrator perform necromancy on his behalf. What a guy. I hope he got a raise. So the administrator, well, he performed necromancy, and he got an answer that yes, that a man named Macrinus was going to kill Caracalla. So the administrator is writing the emperor a letter along the lines of, you're going to want to see this, and sent the information off to the emperor. But by a twist of fate and a strange turn of events, wouldn't you know? Well, Macrinus intercepted the letter. How fun! So, I don't know why, but Macrinus opens the letter. Unclear if it was a mistake. But he opens the letter and was understandably shocked to find that he was apparently supposed to murder Caracalla, and kind of put two and two together, realizing that this letter condemned him even though he hadn't done anything, and realized that if the emperor got a hold of this and thought that he was planning to overthrow him, well, by that point, he could kiss his life goodbye because the emperor wasn't going to stand for that. So Macrinus, in order to save his own butt, well, he kills the emperor, as one does, just to ensure that he's not going to lose his own life. And by doing so, he actually makes the prophecy come true. He self-fulfills the prophecy. So, this is kind of an example of why people would have been concerned of individuals finding out death predictions. So you're probably wondering at this point in time, why would ancient individuals want to perform necromancy? Was a question really worth killing for or raising a ghost for? Well, some were really invested in finding out the length of reigns and life expectancies of Roman emperors, but that wasn't everybody. Other reasons some of us can relate to. Of course, the most popular reason was to find out answers to questions that you had, because shades and ghosts had access to secret knowledge and information you might want to be aware of, including knowing where treasure is located. Yeah, treasure. This is actually one of the reasons people would perform necromancy. And there's even one myth that a guy named Periander, well, he murders his wife Melissa. And later on, he would go and perform necromancy to raise her ghost up because he wanted to find the location of hidden treasure and thought his dead wife would know where it was. So there's that. You may also need to perform necromancy if you are looking to do a specific type of curse or binding spell, which essentially means that a spell needed to be carried out in order for the secondary part to occur. And some curse tablets from the Greco-Roman period that survive show that these ghosts that you conjured up could actually be summoned to do your bidding, and some could even be bribed into doing your bidding for you. If the price is right, a little bit of if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of deal going on. You may have to do necromancy to get rid of a pesky ghost, because yes, necromancy could also help rid you of your hauntings. Because to the ancients, ghosts could be very pesky. And when things go bump in the night in the ancient world, you may have needed to perform necromancy to make it stop. There is, in fact, a story of ancient Greeks kind of being held hostage by a ghost, if you will. So much so that they actually had to consult the oracle at Delphi because the ghost of Actaeon was out and about and being pretty disruptive and was throwing rocks and damaging their countryside. The ancients are truly just like us, having their own stories of haunted places and disruptive ghosts. So when you needed to help put a ghost down and really kind of put their spirits at ease, for all pun intended, well, that was actually referred to as laying a ghost, which just means that you might have to do something so that their spirits find peace. So, for example, if you needed to lay a ghost because they were just causing a kerfuffle up in the mortal realm, well, it may be because their body was never given proper funerary rites or was never given a proper burial or funeral or anything. So you might just have to bury them. Or perhaps you might have to actually get justice for said spirit. Perhaps they were part of a crime or conflict and their ghost and shade still wanted justice from the other side. Basically, think of today when you watch movies like Casper, you might have some unfinished business to do or to attend to. So you, as a living being, would probably just need to help the spirit out so that they would find peace and move on. And one of the reasons that people might be performing necromancy in the underworld that I honestly can firmly say that I understand is really to just see a loved one more time. Which, I mean, at the end of the day, who wouldn't want a few more minutes with a loved family member, a loved one, a pet, just for another minute or two so that you could just say that you loved them one more time? I truly understand that. But there is a double-edged sword with this last one specifically. Because if you were to perform necromancy really just to see a loved one final time, sure, their spirit could be excited to see you and get another taste of life and humanity one last time, or they could be upset and borderline pissed because you dragged their ghost butt up back to the mortal realm. And sometimes going through that process for a deceased shade, it was believed that they actually experienced the pain of dying again. So if that happened to a shade that you were trying to raise, well, they might not greet you with the best mood or best intentions, and may in fact uno reverse you, where they will actually prophesize when you are going to die. And we actually have stories in antiquity of this, of a woman scouring a battlefield trying to see if her son perished, finding his body and performing necromancy, and the son was so upset that he actually prophesied when his mother was going to die. Now, we talked last time about some of the spirits that you might want to invoke if you were writing a curse tablet. And in necromancy, if you needed something to be done, well, you would probably go to very similar ones. And for necromancy, we're not going to be trying to summon a ghost like Casper the Friendly Ghost. Nope. The ancients were going to try and use restless spirits, so those would be for those who died untimely deaths under sad circumstances. Think of the saddest of all circumstances. And of course, all death is extremely sad, but you would really be going for like the big hitters, including individuals who perhaps died right before they were married and children, or soldiers who were killed in action. Why? Because a lot of the times their bones were never properly buried. So any soldier who was KIA, well, their spirit was considered to be restless until they had the proper burial rites. And unfortunately, back in the Roman period, sometimes that just wasn't possible to be able to retrieve their body. And because these spirits were considered to be more restless, they actually may be a little bit more inclined to help you out, especially if you needed something from them. So you may be wondering, how did ancient individuals actually perform necromancy? Do we know? And from scholars and archaeologists, we can actually piece together a little bit about the ritual of necromancy, at least a little bit more than, say, what we could talk about for initiation rites for ancient mystery cults. But let's talk about what it would look like. Well, normally, let's say if we needed to perform necromancy, we would be going to an ancient site that specialized in it. So, for today, we were talking about the Teomim Cave, but a famous necromancy site is that of Heraklia Pontica, and that's also a cave site, so let's use that one for today. So, with this site, we would be going to seek professional guidance, and let's say we finally found a priest or a priestess who could help us. Well, normally there would have been a type of purification ritual that we would have had to undergo before we brought anybody back to life. And the purification could not only be for us who are trying to, perform necromancy, but also the site itself could perform purification rituals where they are just cleansing everything before beginning. You know how surgeons wash their hands and really scrub up before they go into surgery? Well, ancient necromancers were kind of doing the same thing. They may be burning herbs, incense, and more to help purify the area. They would also be burning sulfur, which, if you ever smelled sulfur burning, I remember smelling it the first time when I was in AP chemistry in high school, and woof. If you're wondering what it smells like, it is rotten eggs. And the necromancer who is helping us, well, they may actually need to go through a purification process of their own, or they may have already been doing it so that they could perform it for us. So the purification rituals that they could have gone through could have been certain dietary restrictions, or that, say, they even had to go cleanse themselves nearby. And the purification rites and rituals that we see about in ancient texts and everything, they really differ place by place. So every single necromancy site seems to have their own preferences, and even every necromancer seems to have their own preferences as well, because something that works for them might not work for another necromancer. And alrighty, everybody's prepped, everybody's set, we're gonna perform necromancy. Well, it would be done at night because that's the hour of the ghosts. It's gotta be dark, it's gotta be spooky. But if you were doing this outside, you needed it to be at night. But if we're in a cave, caves and other dark places work just as well. And we're gonna be leaving offerings to the ghost of the individual that we're trying to raise. Since Antonius, Hadrian's lover, was a famous one, let's say we're trying to raise him. So if we were back at an ancient site, we would be leaving offerings to the ghost. And offerings in this case can be very similar to the offerings that you would leave at a funeral. Milk, honey, oil, anything like that could have been left as an offering. It could also be baked goods as well, like little loaves of bread or little cakes. And we know this because we see some funerary vessels that actually depict it. And that helps us as archaeologists because we love when art mimics reality. And in some stories of necromancy, this is kind of where some of the distrust and the ill intention rumors would come from Roman necromancy stories, is that sometimes in stories and rumors that human blood would be offered to the spirit as well. But if blood was ever going to be offered in necromantic practices, it would have likely been sheep's blood. Alrighty, I had to do my lips off screen because I was stressed. I was getting a little stressed out. And then moving on, for necromancies, you would need to dig 2 pits. So the first pit would actually be there to receive the blood and other liquid libations, such as honey, milk, wine, and more. And then the other pit would have actually been used to build a fire. And then in the fire, you would actually sacrifice and burn an offering. Usually they sacrifice a black sheep or a bull, depending on what you could afford. And offerings that were in the pit without the fire, that was for the ghosts. And the offerings and sacrifices that were burned within the fire, well, those were offerings left to appease the gods of the underworld so that they felt inclined to let a ghost or a shade that you needed to come back up to the mortal realm. But sometimes in references of necromancy, we only see a reference to one pit. Once we left our offerings, we would say prayers, incantations, and appeal to the various gods and the ghost specifically that we have in mind. And sometimes, there's a lot of distance between the mortal realm and that of the underworld. So sometimes if the gods didn't hear you, you might have to get on your hands and knees and actually hit the ground a few times to wake up the ghosts or to entice the gods down below. But also there was another problem, because if one ghost comes up for us, if Antonius is let out, well, sometimes there could be a bum rush of other shades, spirits, and ghosts trying to make way out of the underworld and come back up to the mortal realm. So this is why we would need a sword and or dagger to poke at them and tell them to get back. Now, of course, if we wanted to reanimate a corpse, we could also do that during necromancy, but not every necromancy had reanimation done. And if you didn't have to deal with a bum rush of spirits coming out of the underworld, sometimes the ghosts might not want to help you. So you might have to bribe them or make an oath with them where they have to perform and uphold their end of the bargain. And some ghosts, well, after they answered a question, a singular question, they might slip away and disappear, leaving you with some unanswered questions. And see, we raised Antonius's shade together and we asked our questions and we're done. So how do you get rid of a ghost that you just summoned up from the underworld? Well, that's simple. You would just take some milk, dip your hand in it, and then flick it at the ghosts. Why milk? Why are we flicking milk at ghosts? No one knows. It's just something that you did in the ancient world. And in Greek and Latin literature, it's pretty clear that necromancy was not something done every single day. Necromancy was not something that everybody would have been doing. It was considered bold, daring, and very, very dangerous. If you went into the underworld as your form of necromancy, as a mere mortal, who's to say you're going to come back? So while we have evidence coming from necromantions and even this cave coming from the Roman imperial period, we also have evidence on curse tablets of necromancy occurring, as well as spells in the Greek magical papyri, showing that the practice continued on. So even though there were people who were against necromancy, well, it's safe to say that it was still practiced in the later Roman imperial period. And at the end of the day, while necromancy can be considered spooky and even different, perhaps necromancy was only as bad or ill-intentioned as the individual performing it. And like the tablets from the Cursed Well of Athens, perhaps these cave finds should be viewed not as a scary practice of divination, witchcraft, magic, and more, but as another way that ancient people sought guidance from the future, or to say I love you one last time. But what do you guys think? And more importantly, would you guys perform it? Now, with that being said, that is where I'm going to leave you for the end of Spooky Month. I have enjoyed this all with you. I hope you like the final look. I had to do the lips off screen. I was getting stressed out. And I had to kind of do a darker top lip because Thorn from the Hex Girls has a darker top lip. So I had to kind of improvise for that. So hope you guys like the look. Happy Halloween and if you guys want to come actually see a portal, an entryway into the underworld, we are going to see one at the site of Hierapolis in Turkey on our Turkey trip. So come along with an archaeologist and art historian with all of your other ancient history loving friends. That's probably one of the stops that I'm most excited for because, I mean, we talked about necromancy, we've talked about portals into the underworld, caves into the underworld entrances now in the Dirt Diaries. Have a very spooky Halloween. Please stay safe, you guys. And as always, keep your books open, stay curious, and I'll see you guys next time on the Dirt Diaries.